Does anybody have any idea how the Clotting Cascade works?
Oh, gosh. I don't think there is a simple way to describe it.
It depends on how much time we have.
I can draw or I can just talk. Okay, you're cheering. You're muted, but you're cheering.
Let's get into the nerddom.
Gotta find a pen. Here we go.
Dr. Redding.
They fasten my seatbelt. Very brief aside, I had this experience once when my kids were small. We were driving to Iowa. We're in the car, and one of my kids says, "Dad, how does blood clot?" And I'm like, "Oh, this is perfect. I've got you trapped for 3 hours in this car."
Welcome back to Ask the Expert, a podcast where experts are asked all the tough questions so we break down complex science into conversations that you can actually understand. I am your host, Amy Board, and if you are an original Ask the Expert listener, the OG listeners, as I like to call them, then you are in for a treat. In our previous format, we had one expert per episode. We'd pick a topic, and then we'd do a deep dive with an expert about something bleeding disorder related. But this season of Ask the Expert is just a little different. For the next 12 episodes, we're going to focus on a new class of drugs for hemophilia. At the moment, this class is being labeled as rebalancing agents. The science behind these bad boys is fascinating, and the mechanism of action is really something every one of us should consider when deciding what treatment would work best for us and our lifestyle. And did I mention these drugs work for hemophilia A and B? Oh, and did I also mention these bad boys are sub-Q? Very, very, very cool. So Ask the Expert this year is going to pull back the curtain on rebalancing agents, how they work, why do they work, the safety risks, the future research being done in this space. So join me and our experts all year for Ask the Expert Hemophilia on Balance. Thank you to our presenting sponsor, Sanofi. We couldn't do this show without you, and we are so grateful.
Health equity starts with understanding. Meet Shelley, a woman whose hemophilia diagnosis challenged stereotypes and inspired her to drive change. After years of unanswered questions, Shelley's story highlights the power of health literacy to close care gaps and uplift underserved communities. Scan the QR code or click the link in the show notes to watch her inspiring journey and learn how health literacy transforms lives.
We have to start with the Clotting Cascade. Don't groan! I can hear you groaning. The Clotting Cascade is cool, and I'm going to prove it. Well, with the help of my experts. In future episodes, I'll give a larger introduction to each of our experts, but for starters, I've got Dr. Ben Samuelson Jones here to give us an overview of how our body naturally heals itself when our blood vessels are injured. Dr. Ben is a pediatric hematologist at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. He specializes in bleeding and clotting disorders, sickle cell disease, and other blood disorders. Dr. Ben, how does the Clotting Cascade work to help our blood clot?
It depends on how much time we have. So the coagulation cascade is a key component of what we call the hemostatic system, right? So your blood has to do this amazing thing. When it's in your blood vessel, it has to be liquid to carry all the nutrients around. And as soon as it leaves the blood vessel, it's supposed to fill that hole where it left. So it has to very quickly go from liquid to solid at the precisely right time. When the blood's in the wrong place, it's supposed to be solid. And there's the cellular component of that, and that's mostly in the hemostatic system. That's mostly platelets, but the other blood cells, like white blood cells and platelets, and the cells that line the blood vessels, they all play a role. And then the solution part of the blood, the acellular part, the part that doesn't have the cells, has a bunch of proteins floating around, and they also contribute to this hemostatic system, and that's really the coagulation cascade. And to form that solid plug, the output of the coagulation cascade is insoluble fibrin. So that means that it comes out of solution and forms like a web. And you can sort of think about that as like the platelets and other cells are forming a plug, and then that this fibrin web sits down on top of it, but it's really like a cement. It fills in all the nooks and crannies and just plugs that hole. And that's the final output. And how it does that, and it has to do this very quickly, right? Because you want the blood to recognize that it's in the wrong place, and then very quickly amplify that signal of being in the wrong place to form this web and cement. And it does this with the coagulation cascade. And what that is that's a series of proteins that are in a latent or inactive form, and then they're sequentially activated to do their biological thing. And the central mediator is making thrombin, And that does a lot of stuff. So the thrombin is what converts fibrinogen to fibrin, which makes that ultimate web. But it also then feeds back and amplifies the signal.
In simplistic terms, let's get Dr. Amy Dunn on here to break it down even further. Dr. Dunn is a pediatric hematologist at Nationwide Children's Hospital in Ohio.
Basically, anytime there's injury of the blood vessel, there is sort of initial chemical signal that goes up, and the end goal is to make something called thrombin. And to do that, you really need a whole cascade of things to happen, which is why it's called the Clotting Cascade. It used to be called a waterfall, but the different clotting proteins basically work like a series of dominoes, right? One turns on the next, turns on the next, turns on the next, and eventually everything works together to form a stable clot.
Okay, so when a blood vessel is injured, your body detects the damage and sends out signals to start the repair process, kind of like amplification. So what starts all that?
One of the ways that you get this amplification, so you very quickly recognize that you're outside the blood vessel, and then you make a lot of thrombin and therefore a lot of fibrin, is that each step you make more of the next thing. And so it gets kicked off with what we call the extrinsic pathway, combining factor 7 and tissue factor. And tissue factors is one of the ways that the blood recognizes that's in the wrong place, because you're not supposed to have tissue factor exposed to your coagulation factor. So once it's exposed, the 7 becomes, it's really 7, activated factor 7, becomes activated. And that results in making a little bit of thrombin. And then that little bit of thrombin then feeds back and kicks off an amplification loop. And it directly activates factor 8 and indirectly factor 9. And that's why when you're missing factor 8 or factor 9, you can't kick off that, you're missing that whole amplification loop. And that's why you end up making less thrombin and therefore have trouble plugging that hole.
Okay, I'm starting to understand that thrombin is extremely important in the whole clotting system. Is that right?
If you had a map of the clotting universe, thrombin would be like right at the center.
Okay, we'll get into the nitty-gritty of thrombin in episode 3. So let's welcome Dr. Patrick Ellsworth to Ask the Expert. Dr. Pat, how often do our blood vessels get damaged to initiate the clotting process?
In hemophilia, we usually talk about a lot of bleeds being spontaneous, and they're probably not spontaneous in the sense that there's nothing that triggered it. It's just that it's something so small, just, a movement of a normal joint, maybe disrupting a teeny tiny capillary or blood vessel, that hemostasis normally would say like, yep, this is normal. There's just a little bit of tissue turnover. We're going to stop any bleeding here. But if you're completely missing, say, factor 8 or factor 9, the body can't stop.
Okay. Let's pause for a sec and chat about primary hemostasis. This happens before the clotting cascade. So platelets and von Willebrand factor, you're up. Primary hemostasis is the first step in stopping bleeding when a blood vessel is injured. It happens quickly and involves the formation of a temporary platelet plug at the site of an injury. Tiny blood cells called platelets rush to the scene and stick together to form a temporary plug to stop the bleeding. Think of them kind of like bricks in a wall. Primary hemostasis is fast, but not strong enough to fully stop the bleeding. So, the clotting cascade, or, as fancy people call it, secondary hemostasis, steps in to reinforce the platelet plug with a fibrin mesh. The sticky platelets attach to the damaged vessel wall and to each other, forming a temporary plug that helps stop bleeding. This process is supported by von Willebrand factor. Let's give it up for von Willebrand factor. We love it. And von Willebrand factor helps platelets stick to that vessel wall.
So the platelets and the von Willebrand factor, that's sort of that initial plug that fills that initial hole, and then all of the numbered clotting proteins sort of come down over top of that and make a stable clot. So it's complicated, and it's kind of remarkable that it ever works right.
Secondary hemostasis is the second phase of the blood clotting process. It strengthens and stabilizes the initial platelet plug formed during primary hemostasis by creating that strong fibrin mesh that our experts talked about. Your blood has special proteins, clotting factors, Us hemophilia folk, we all know those clotting factors, and those guys work like dominoes, each activating the next in a chain reaction, and this is called the clotting cascade.
But coagulation proteins are all these proteins, and there's different types. There's ones called proteases, which are kind of like scissors. They go around and, kind of cut things and do things, and they change other proteins. And then there's things that are called cofactors in the coagulation cascade. And there's all sorts of those proteins. And so for hemophilia, the ones we hear about the most are factor 8 and factor 9.
So how does the clotting system work in simple terms? When I explain this to people, what I try to do is start with the concept that the clotting system is really just a bunch of proteins that are all floating around in our blood that all interact together. These proteins are all made in the liver, and they circulate in an inactive form. And so they're kind of just floating around there, waiting for something to happen. When the clotting system gets turned on, either because we have an injury or you have surgery or you're bleeding for some reason, the clotting system gets turned on. And what that means is that a series of reactions starts where some of these proteins interact with each other and they activate the next protein in line, and that activates the next protein in line. It's kind of a cascade effect. We think about it, we call it the clotting cascade. So it's a series of reactions where one thing leads to the next thing. It's kind of like dominoes falling, maybe, is a way to think about it. The goal of all of that is to generate this stuff called thrombin. So thrombin is a protein that's really crucial in the clotting system. It's kind of like if you could draw a map of the clotting system and all of the parts and all the moving pieces, like thrombin's kind of right in the center of that.
These proteins work together to produce thrombin, an enzyme that kind of acts like glue.
When we're talking about hemostasis and thrombosis, it's all about how much thrombin and where is it, because it's got to go to the right place and you've got to make enough of it. And if you have hemophilia, you can't make enough of it. And we'll talk about why that is.
Thrombin then converts a protein called fibrinogen into fibrin, which forms that strong mesh that we talked about over that platelet plug, kind of holding it together like cement, like cement and bricks and all the things like up against a wall. What is the difference between the intrinsic and the extrinsic pathway?
Yeah, these are just two sort of different arms of the clotting system. So when we first were learning how the clotting system worked, we kind of, drew it out on a big piece of paper or probably a big chalkboard back in the day, right? And we think about these two pathways, the intrinsic and extrinsic pathway, as sort of two different ways to generate thrombin. There's different proteins involved and different things turn on each of those pathways. They're both important and ultimately it all kind of works together. But the way we kind of get the ball rolling or the way the clotting system gets started in its production of thrombin to make a clot depends a little bit on what the trigger is. And so the intrinsic pathway gets kicked in a little bit different way than the extrinsic pathway, but ultimately they all work together. So the TFPI kind of works on one side of that to put the brakes on in that place. There's other brakes in other parts of it.
Once the injury is healed, the body slowly breaks down that clot so blood can flow normally once again. This process is carefully controlled because if you think about it, too much clotting can be dangerous and it can cause dangerous blockages, while too little can lead to excessive bleeding. We know all about that in the bleeding disorders community. So it's all about balance.
So the goal of this clotting cascade is to generate thrombin, which is the stuff that really helps us make a clot when we need to. So that's the clot making part of it. But there's another part of it, which is what we call the clot regulating part. So there's a whole other series of proteins that work in a similar way. And their job is to kind of balance all this out. So you've got all this clot making going on, but you've got to have a system to kind of regulate that, keep it in balance, make sure that you don't make too much clot, because otherwise you'll clot more than you need to, and that's a problem. So we've got this whole system of sort of clot making proteins and clot regulating proteins, and we think about these things as all kind of being in a balance. Under normal circumstances, the clotting system is a balance, and when you need to make some clot, it tips one way just a little bit, but not too far, because the regulatory proteins kind of keep it in check. And then when you don't need to make more clot, that kind of gets back into balance. And if it goes the other direction, that causes other problems. So it's this sort of delicate balance that's constantly kind of there in the background, keeping us all from bleeding or clotting. I think the other, another thing that really contributes to our enthusiasm is these things have been a long time coming. These clinical trials started, some of them 10 or more years ago, even, these clinical trial programs. So some of these new medicines have been in development for a really, really long time. And there's been all this kind of anticipation, and, you go to the meetings and they show you some data and it seems like it's going okay. And, but we have to wait. And, we start talking to our patients about these new drugs as they're kind of coming through the pipeline. So I think a lot of it, honestly, is just that we've been waiting for a long time. It's kind of like, when you're a kid, you start getting excited about Christmas about, April 1st, right? And it's a long wait. It's kind of like it's December now is here.
#MyHemophilia Truth. Real stories powered by Sanofi. It's time to consider the whole experience when it comes to managing hemophilia and change the conversation. Explore the full story at www.myhemophiliatruth.com.
Wow, what a deep dive into the Clotting Cascade. Huge thanks to Dr. Amy Dunn, Dr. Ben Samuelson Jones, Dr. Mark Redding, and Dr. Patrick Ellsworth for walking us through the complex but fascinating world of how our blood knows when to clot and when to stay fluid. Understanding this process is key to appreciating the impact of new treatments like rebalancing agents. And trust me, we've only scratched the surface. In future episodes, we'll explore more about thrombin, which we learned is super important. We'll learn more about the intrinsic and extrinsic pathways, also super important, also very nerdy, and the exciting potential of these new therapies. So stay tuned. There's a lot more to come on Ask the Expert Hemophilia on Balance. So we'll see you next time. I want to thank our presenting sponsor, Sanofi, just one more time. We couldn't do it without you folks. Thank you so much for the emphasis that you place on education for the community. We really appreciate it. Did you know bloodstreammedia.com is your one-stop shop for all podcasts for the bleeding disorders and rare disease community? There you can find links to the Global Hemophilia Report and our flagship podcast, Bloodstream, with your hosts, me and Patrick James Lynch. Also check out Flow, which is straight talk about extreme periods, and the Pain Pod, which is an in-depth storytelling odyssey of chronic pain. All this and more on bloodstreammedia.com, the #1 podcast network for rare disease. Have an idea for a future episode of Ask the Expert? Or have a question that you would like to hear one of our experts answer? Email us at mailbag@bloodstreammedia.com. You'll also find Bloodstream Media on Facebook and on Twitter and on Instagram and all those social media channels. I am your host, Amy Board, and until next time, stay curious, my friends.